Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome William Finnegan and moderator David Davis.
Hello.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you. Thank you for coming out early. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you to the organizers and everybody here putting this together and the volunteers. You guys have been just very gracious and really appreciate it. Make this a very pleasant experience. So we'll get right to this and talk about Barbarian Days. But before I get started, when I was doing research on the book that became Waterman, a biography of Duke Kahanamoku, I was starting to sort of look into the research, and I had a old file of clips of surf articles, and it wasn't very thick because there, frankly, hasn't been that many great surf lit out there. But I had a very well-worn Xerox copy of Doc's games from the New Yorker, 92, 93,
Yep.
and that was Bill's two-parter in the New Yorker that just sort of blew everybody away in terms of writing about surfing in a different way. And I'm just wondering, when that came out, did you look at that as going, hey, I want to do some more on this subject? Or was that did you look at it as a one-off and, hey, I did a nice piece on what I was up to in the San Francisco surfing scene?
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. For me too. It's fun. I didn't even feel that good about it. You know, it was a nice piece. I was so ambivalent about even writing that piece. It was the first. I was freelancing in the '80s, living in San Francisco, and I sent a short political piece, mainly write about politics, to the New Yorker. It was the first thing I'd sold to them, and at that, I mean, with someone in the editor's office, they bought it and ran it, and she told me, if you want to write something longer for the magazine, now's your chance. You've got the editor's attention, and I thought she meant, you got 30 seconds. And I didn't have any ideas. So I trying to come up with something, and I said, okay, how about a profile of this guy I was surfing with at the time, this big wave surfer in San Francisco, quite colorful guy, a cancer specialist, physician, really interesting guy, and I could kind of see him in a John McPhee piece of the period. And so I said, how about a profile of this big wave surfer in San Francisco? And they said yes, and I had the assignment. And then I took 7 years to write it. I don't know how many of you know the magazine business. I missed a couple of deadlines in there. But I mean, I didn't do nothing in that 7 years. I moved to New York and wrote some books, and I joined the staff at the New Yorker and wrote a lot of stuff about politics. But the whole time thinking, do I really want to come out of the closet as a surfer? Especially as I was writing a lot of opinion as well as reporting. So I was involved in sort of policy debates, and I thought there's no better way to undercut your credibility than to say, by the way, it's me, dude, Especially the people I was sort of involved in public debate with would really love to say, oh, you're just a dumb surfer. We don't need to take you seriously. Everybody from the Kennedy School sort of crowd. Anyway, so I finally did finish this piece, and it came out. And I also delayed mainly because I was dreading that the main character of the piece, really a profile, as a protagonist, would hate what I was going to write. Because I had done some reporting that changed my view of him somewhat from when I proposed it. Basically, I was writing about this very small community of surfers in San Francisco at the time. Now it's big, but it was just a few of us. And as soon as people noticed me kind of following him around, writing things down, and I would interview people and so on, I was sort of Boswell to this guy. They kind of came out of the woodwork and were really hostile. They turned out this guy was really unpopular, and they wanted, write this down. He's, and so I knew all that and thought I can't really portray this community accurately without including some suggestion that he's not everybody's favorite person. And I knew he would hate that. So no matter how subtle about that I tried to be, he hated the piece. So there was that.
Yeah.
So my feelings were very ambivalent when it came out. But and I did want to be done with it. But it got a fair amount of attention, and my publisher wanted to bring it out as a book. It was book length, back in the day, multi-part New Yorker pieces, 92. And I said, no, the protagonist hates it, no. But that sort of planted the seed that there might be something else. In my discussion with her, trying to put her off, I was saying, no, I've surfed with much more interesting people than him, and much more interesting places than San Francisco. And so, of course, she said, oh, good, write that book. And I, over decades, was slowly persuaded that was a good idea, or worked on it in fits and starts.
Right. What were some of the, you talk about getting a cache of letters that you had written back when you were a young teenager, I guess, that sort of jump-started some of this, what became Barbarian Days. So how did that work in relation to, what you had already sort of been written?
Yeah, I guess I've told that story. I was working with a lot of journals, trying to write about this sort of life in surfing, sort of an surfing-themed autobiography, and I kept quite good journals when I was young, and wrote a lot of letters, and was getting some of those letters back, and those had more sort of surfing detail than my journals did, which were more concerned with my love life, and that was pretty useless, my journals, and just kind of identity stuff and what I was working on at the time always, but letters were quite rich with detail of what was going on in my life at different times, and this box came out of the blue from my best friend in high school, who didn't know I was working on this book, and who's not the kind of person to keep letters, but his mother had apparently thrown them all in a box and left it in their garage for decades, and here it was, and it was letters I'd written from. I grew up in Southern California, and then we moved to Hawaii when I was 13. I was already a pretty serious surfer, and so it was just heaven to be there. But I apparently wrote. I didn't even remember writing these. There was dozens and dozens of letters, like every night, hundreds of pages. When I was 13 and 14, I was writing about my adventures to my friend back on the mainland, and it was so. The writing was beyond abysmal. Really embarrassing. Absolutely everything was bitching. This girl was bitching. This wave was bitching. It was just no evidence of talent. But such detail, and it would actually bring all this back. It was like it's like a Proustian Madeleine. I just bit into these letters, and it all came back, and I just thought, and especially about my school in Honolulu as a middle school, and I just thought, this is where this book starts. And I later debated with, I think we were talking about this. This book kind of starts twice. That's it backs up in the second chapter and fills in before that, but my editor wasn't happy about that. Why are we starting this book twice?
Right.
But I was just, a sort of intuitive sense. This is the foundation. I can build something big on this Honolulu story.
Right.
And so
salt encrusted Madeleine.
Yeah.
Well, and we did talk about that. That you start in Hawaii. The book, the memoir, starts in Hawaii and then goes back to chronologically to your beginnings of surfing in Southern California, and it struck me on a couple levels, but certainly one of them just that sense of serendipity that your family happened to move out to Southern California when you're a youngster, which is the perfect time to begin surfing at a time when Gidget has come out and Dick Dale, and so surfing culture is actually starting to ramp up. And then your family moves to Hawaii, which is, the birthplace of all of this. Would we have a different memoir, I guess, if that had changed, if that serendipity was a different direction?
Yeah, it does seem, and I think other people would find this too, as you think about the sort of narrative of your life and the sequences, there's often this feeling like, oh my God, if only this hadn't happened, it might have been just as interesting in any other form. Once you sort of fashion it and write it and connect up these things, it has a feeling of inevitability, and in my case, lots of luck that this happened, that happened. But there were, and it's funny, some people interested as you are in sort of history or journalism of surfing had said to me, "You're like Forrest Gump. You were here. You were here. You were here at the perfect time," and that's not true. It's just I make something out of in the book. For instance, in surfing, there was something in 1968 that's known as the shortboard revolution. There was this, design revolution, and surfboards got much smaller, and the sort of whole intent of what people are doing on waves sort of changed in that moment, and going forward from there. And I was a kid surfing when that happened, and it's true that I happened to be at the spot here in California, Rincon, up on the on the Santa Barbara Ventura County line. There's a great wave, and I happened to be there and see the first shortboard I ever saw, surfing in a kind of way that was like hard for the eye to follow. Actually, you'd see him here, and then he was there, and you couldn't. It was so different from what we were doing surfboards at the time, and it was this incredible thing, and a rare kind of Coliseum moment, a sports highlight moment. Surfing doesn't really lend itself to that kind of stuff, but there it was. And I was 14. I didn't know what I was seeing, but it was exciting. And then I realized who the guy was, a kind of famous Australian surfer. And so I wrote about that, and that's the kind of thing that surf historians and surf journalists say, "You were there the day McTavish surfed Rincon. Wow, you're Forrest Gump." And not true. I missed large parts of surfing history because I wasn't really paying attention. I was doing what I was doing. I was mainly interested in books. But then, this is the end of that little story, I got this most gratifying letter, probably a year after the book came out, from Bob McTavish, this kind of legendary underground guy Australian surfer shaper who was one of the first surfers on a shortboard. And he just said, "You were there." "Oh my God. I've been my mates have been telling me I was lying for 40 years. I've been saying I surfed a 10-foot day at Rincon in which I made waves from the indicator to the cove," and people were absolutely screaming and applauding. This does not happen in surfing. And of course, none of his friends believed him. And yet here it was in a book, exactly as he'd been telling it. It was so gratifying. I didn't even know he's still alive.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Well, speaking of which, and I do want to talk about sort of surfing lit, and in a sense that there hasn't been this history of, there's no stat. We know there's no game, there's no stats, there's none of that. But again, in terms of your influences at that time, you've mentioned, Endless Summer coming out. What was that, 65, 64, 65?
It had a limited release, like in high schools up and down the coast, and then a general release in 66.
Right. And which you, of course, call Endless Winter, which I think is a beautiful term in the book. But also certainly, and you mentioned this with Jack Kerouac on the road, and when you become a little bit older and you can get out there and run around and see the world, it seems like that's part of, those two are sort of your core of going forward.
Yeah, those were touchstones for me, both as a writer and what I chose to do. In fact, Kerouac had worked on the railroad a little bit, and when I finished college, I hired out as a brakeman on the Southern Pacific and worked a few years doing that. I had those. But Endless Summer is a funny thing. You guys know that movie, this documentary from the mid-'60s? It was kind of wonderful period piece, and set terms that warped a generation, including me. We saw that and thought, that's what we have to do. Like when we get big, when we grow up, we have to travel around the world looking for the perfect wave. And of course, there's no such thing as a perfect wave, but that idea was really implanted deep in people like me, and it was so odd. And I followed through. I mean, I saved money working on the railroad, and a friend who had the same feeling, like, it's like mandatory. You got to do this, even if you don't feel like it. Okay, it's time for us to, and we set off. I was gone nearly 4 years, and I write about it a lot, and mainly in the Southern Hemisphere, just chasing waves, trying to find new spots, and living, all kinds of jobs to finance as I tumbled along. And it was so ironic to realize later, and I would say endless winter because waves are generally better in winter, so you're actually chasing a different season entirely. But I at some point realized that was this, not a documentary, it was this filmmaker's concoction. He got an idea, hired a couple of guys, like like equivalent of pro surfers, best surfers around at the time, Robert August and Mike Hinson. And it was like a 6-week photo shoot. It was a little project. That's not what they did with their lives. They didn't like throw away their education, their lives, like I did, this ridiculous, endless thing, which was, it's all very fun in retrospect. But the truth was, there were lots of very low moments. As you think, I thought there were, like, what the people I went to college with or graduate school with, and they're all off getting ahead in the world. They're professors or whatever now, and I'm like lying here dying of malaria in Sumatra. What did I do? And so it was a lot of slogging and being a surf bum when I wasn't entirely convinced that was the thing to do with my life.
Yeah, I guess what I thought was interesting on those two core influences, I think a lot of the, what certainly later, people who were sort of chasing waves, they were seen more in sort of like a hippie mode, let's say, whereas maybe it really was more out of a beat mode on the Kerouac side, and hey, let's let civilized society, let's leave that behind and see what else is out there.
Yeah, hence the title of this book. There was this kind of basic opposition in I lead this sort of bipolar life, and as I say, I'm a journalist, a political journalist primarily, and my other books are much more journalistic, and I have this sort of good citizen side where I try to inform my readers and be part of society, and then I have this other impulse. I still surf pretty seriously, and it's just the opposite, and it's it's the North Pole of irresponsibility for me, surfing, as opposed to this other thing. And I'm trying to reconcile these two through my life, and it's got a big kind of resonance in Hawaii, where we moved when I was young, and there was as Dave knows well, a kind of basic opposition between the colonizers, led by missionaries in the early 19th century in Hawaii, who did successfully transform local society into a cash economy, and of course the population was decimated by disease, and surfing was a kind of focus, something to extirpate, something to get rid of. They were very, everybody surfed. There was a kind of surplus of food and production, plenty of time to play around in old Hawaii, and people surfed, and they really wanted to get rid of that to make sure people were in church or at work, and they nearly succeeded. So there was that opposition between, savagery, as the missionaries would call it, and civilization, or as to say, Calvinist business values, and so these are like central tensions in my book.
Right. When does that start change? In other words, when you're a young man and you sort of leave things behind, leave civilized society behind, so to speak, to go chase waves, it very much was sort of a statement of, hey, I'm gonna get out there and see something different, and a little bit of a rebel aspect, of course. When does it change that there's now surf culture? There's now this marketing phenomenon of, we're in the middle of the desert and you go to the mall and there's a Quicksilver shop there.
Yeah, that's kind of going on in parallel to my life over time, and me uninterested in it, and pro surfing and sort of mainstreaming and the growth of interest in surfing and these little industries, really, wetsuits, surfboards, I don't know, sunglasses, whatever they make and sell. But growing, and places getting more crowded, which is a main reason for traveling and really bushwhacking. You're trying to find ways where there aren't any other people. Overcrowding is a huge problem in surfing now, and it has been for a long time. So that's sort of been going on. I write a bit about it in this book, but it's just definitely not a chronicle of mainstream surfing or the surf industry or anything. It's just toward the end. I live in New York now, and this is sort of nightmare. These just flashes everywhere I look. It seems like they're selling life insurance, and the taxi cab. It's every, Times Square. It's just like images of surfing that, to me, are kind of, they're like private life, intimate. I mean, I'll just at a glance, how it is. Like if you're deeply involved in something like surfing, you know places. I mean, at a glance, I'll see something up on a big display, say in Times Square in the center of the city, and it's a wave in Indonesia that I first surfed in the 70s, and there was nobody there, and it really meant a lot to me. And what's it doing here? Kind of splayed for it, just to sell stuff, obviously, pickup trucks, whatever they're trying to sell. It's a little much, so I sort of reflect on that in the book, or sort of make fun of it a little bit, but don't turn my analytic powers, such as they are, on the industry.
Right. I mean, as you mentioned, that's one of sort of the tension in the book,
Yeah.
in terms of inside surfing and you sort of approaching it a certain way, somewhat spiritual way, perhaps, soul surfing type of thing, to get into the terminology, versus competitive. And we've talked about this. Surfing's going to be in the Olympics in 2020. Everybody's ready for that, right? In Tokyo.
No.
Yeah, maybe you can address that, competition and surfing and Olympics, and is that part and parcel of making surf culture part of a mainstream?
Well, it is sort of whatever surf culture means, but is that a good thing? It's funny. This is a sort of accelerating effort at the moment. I don't know how it'll come out, but the effort that's got surfing into the Olympics for the first time in Tokyo in 2020, which is slightly separate from the general marketing push by a group called the World Surf League, which now runs the top level pro tours and other tours competition. But I should say that people probably know this, but as you said, there are no stats. Surfing's not particularly organized, really, and most surfers never have anything to do with competition. And I think most surfers have never seen a contest in their lives. It's just those things happen way over on the margins somewhere. At certain places, and most surfers are just involved in the ocean and their understanding of their places and some travel too, and perhaps to famous spots. But it's done for the love of it. It's a quite an addictive kind of pastime, and this stuff happens way over on the edge. But there is this effort, primarily by the surf industry, to grow the sport. And surfers, I think I can speak for most of them in general, want nothing less. We'd rather shrink the sport. I mean, let's stop discussing it. Let's stop marketing it. Let's stop glamorizing it, because it's already too crowded. And the truth is, I mean, a lot of this stuff, they're trying to, of course, now draw a mass audience to watch surfing. That's, they want the WSL, World Surf League, to be up there with the NFL and the NBA. That's what they're hoping for. And obviously surfing is kind of picturesque, and they can use that. But surf contests are incredibly boring. They're just, if you try to watch it, I mean, the ocean doesn't cooperate. A surfer, I can kind of, and I'm not saying I'm not interested in like the top pros. I love to watch them surf, especially if the waves are good. And I'll be working, and I'll have a sort of computer screen, and since I surf, I guess I'm capable of just sitting there looking at it with absolutely nothing. Some guys sitting on a flat ocean, and my editor will come in, or my wife, or someone like that, and they'll say, "What are you doing?" I'll say, "Well, I think there's going to be a set. I think there's something coming. The general sports fan is not going to do this. There might be something soon, but as a surfer, you're used to that." Anyway, there's that part, but there's also the idea like, oh, learn to surf. Like, surf schools have appeared all over the world, like thousands of them, literally thousands. I'm not exaggerating. On every little coast, there's a surf school, and that's, I don't know. I mean, I guess people have some fun at it, but this is not surf culture. This is something completely different. I mean, if we could talk about something called surf culture, people who kind of seriously surf and are really hooked on it. you got to learn as a kid. You can't. I've actually never seen anybody really learn to surf over the age of about 14 or 15. You just can't get the nerve memory. You can't get the. I mean, you can do some simple and sort of beginnerish things, but the dynamic thing that is surfing, you need to learn really young. So I see all these surf schools, and I, of course, meet people in Manhattan all the time. Oh, surfing, I took that up last summer, I learned to surf last summer. Some 58-year-old guy. Oh, yeah? And meaning I went to a surf school in Costa Rica, and they pushed me into a couple and call it surfing. When it's really, as you can, as I'm sure you all know, much more involved, kind of punishing and lifelong thing. So there's that aspect to getting people to do it, and I guess for hope against hope, I sort of hope the whole effort fails, and people sort of forget about surfing, and it doesn't just continue to proliferate the way it has to become more popular. But that's probably hopeless. I don't know what will happen with it.
Yeah, it'll be
The
very
sports marketing juggernaut may not have success with surfing, may give up on it. I mean, we just hope it becomes, like rollerblading, just becomes uncool, and nobody wants anything to do with it, That'd be great.
Well, I think your book is going to maybe reverse that, but that's okay.
No, I've been happy. I mean, some people have said to me, man, here you're doing it too. And I think, ooh, am I? But I've been gratified to have plenty of readers say, I thought I might take up surfing. I was interested in surfing. Then I read your book. No thanks. Never, I mean, it's like scary bits,
the scary
close
bits.
calls, but also just the drudgery and the cuts and the cold and the kind of reality of it. I think reading my book, you can realize that your pipe dreams about maybe I'll surf are not worth pursuing.
Well, it was a question I wanted to ask you. What has been this book has been out now a little while. What has been the reaction, or how has the reaction been different between hardcore surfers and somebody who's never been in the ocean on a board?
Well, it's very much written for the general reader, not for surfers, with sort of everything explained and the sort of technical terms translated, at least in the early going, to get people sort of up to speed to be able to picture the surfing scenes, which aren't a huge percentage of the book actually, but and in their language and understand what's at stake in those scenes. I mean, I hope general readers manage that. I mean, some I'm sure are bored. It's too much water. I've heard that a couple times. Too much water.
That's great.
And then lots of other people who know nothing about surfing or particularly the ocean saying funny things to me like, "Gosh, until I read your book, I thought like every wave was the same. A wave's a wave." This is like a New York attitude. A wave. What's there to say? Well, turns out there's plenty to say, and you can describe each one in its particularity, which is vivid to me and anybody who's involved with waves, but not so much to other people. And then surfers, I may have blocked it out, but I would expect, I can't think of any like lacerating, hateful critiques. I'm not gonna imagine one and how you could put, I might get them and I may have received them and blocked them out, but I can't. In general, it's I'm sure with some ambivalence in the surfing world, and the book's done well in the sort of mainstream world, and that's excites some jealousy and disdain, I'm sure, on the part of some surf writers, because there's a world of surf writers within surfing. They write for surf magazines and websites and so on, all in a very different vein, where everything's understood. Nobody ever describes what it's like to ride a wave, because everybody reading this stuff already knows. I'd say my book's quite different, but nothing, at least not yet, nothing too devastating from inside the tribe.
Well, I mean, we talking about surf lit and this coterie of journalists who, and I won't put it in quotes, who maybe write a certain way, and it's maybe entertaining and to a certain degree, maybe a little bit enlightening to a certain degree, but certainly before your book, there hasn't been that, whether it's yes, there's Matt Warshaw's encyclopedia, but that's which is just a beautiful compendium of anecdotes and heroes and that sort of thing. Why hasn't it been such a presence in literature as a sport, as a pastime, as an activity?
There have been some efforts. There's some novels with some surfing in them. Nothing I love. In fact, when people ask me, "Well, you've written about this. You surf. What are your favorite books about surfing? What should I read?" Sort of thing. I inevitably say Matt Warshaw's History of Surfing, Warshaw's Encyclopedia of Surfing, which are totally they're just technical, giant. He's this fanatical kind of. Almost a Kabbalist or something. He's just obsessed with this stuff and has this tremendous database, and the encyclopedia is online now, so it's full of videos you can watch and whatever. But these are also big fat books, and they're just purely for fanatics. I mean, nobody else, it would mean nothing to anybody else. But those are my favorite surfing books. So there's that problem, though. It illustrates the problem of the insider-outsider thing. It's really hard to translate across. I mean, I've never seen a fictional, like a feature movie or a TV series or anything that's tried to have surfing in it to some degree, usually large degree centrally. I've never seen one that I didn't think was embarrassing, just a disaster. It's like surfing is the cinematic kiss of death, As soon as you have a surfboard in a scene, it's hard to take anybody seriously. There's something that happens there. Keep this in mind. Which I mentioned to people who talk about adapting my book into a film. So there's some difficulty in the translation. I mean, everybody seems to head toward a certain kind of melodrama, which has nothing to do with the reality of surfing. In fact, I find myself talking to filmmakers who are interested in this book. I say, how about a book derived from this with virtually no surfing? Surfing's so picturesque, of course, the cinematographer is attracted to it. And people who do it tend to be, kind of young and good looking, whatever. But how about something else, something much grittier and some way to incorporate surfing into another medium that's popular. It's so far it's been really, I did what I did with this book, but it's not an easy thing to translate. It's so tribal, it has its own language, has its own understandings of the world, and it's very hard to let anybody in without being corny.
I was sort of surprised in doing some research on my projects and going to Hawaii and looking around and going, there's some nice coffee table books and there's some nice sort of very, very complimentary biographies here and there, but nothing that sort of looked at it took it seriously in a way that gave others an intro.
Where people stand outside it as well as sort of from inside and know it. I was surprised. There's a whole genre. I was unaware of this, but when my book came out in Australia, a lot of the reviews said, "Now this is a different sort of surfing book," and I thought, as opposed to what? What are you talking about? Well, it turns out there's like a whole shelf of surfing books in Australia, and they're almost all sports biographies. Like different surf stars, and some of them multiple, and Michael Peterson, like 3 of them. And some of the readers or people who would interview me from Australia would say, "Where are the naughty bits?" And I said, "What do you mean?" It's a surfing book. You've got to like become addicted to cocaine and crash and bottom out, and orgies and drugs, and then it's there's an arc to a surfing book, and this is just like this ordinary person. And other people didn't complain. They'd say, reviewers would say things like, "Finally, a book for the rest of us. Here's this guy who spent his 20s under a palm tree, just like all of us who spent our 20s under a palm tree." I mean, surfing's quite popular in Australia, different from here. I mean, people do know the names of top surfers, top pros, as like sporting champions, which they really don't here. California's a little bit different, but in the U.S., there's very little name recognition of top surfers. So it's funny to get that review and realize that there is a a context.
Yeah.
And I've looked at the books, and they're all bad. And I mean, it's probably a good one. I shouldn't say that, but they're all kind of from within. You know, they're not ambitious.
Yeah.
They're as told to, you know.
Yeah.
And then I got addicted to cocaine, sort of things.
There's some naughty bits in your book. Come on. It's called Barbarian Days.
Yeah.
My God. Does it need to be Barbarian Nights, too, as well? I don't know. Anyway, by the way, we have about 10 minutes left. If there are people who have questions, we'd love to have interaction. Yeah.
Yes.
I've never surfed, but I live near the water, so I see surfers almost on a daily basis. So I'm trying to get some context.
Mm.
If you could, either one of you could comment on, it looks to me like they're mostly waiting.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, is it more like a sport or is it more like Buddhism?
That was my next question.
Well, there is a. I mean, my wife. We've been married for, I don't know, 30 years, 25 years. We've been together forever.
Woof.
I said something wrong.
Yes.
I
Yes.
should know how many years I've been married. We've been together since the early '80s, and she's virtually never seen me surf. I mean, it's so boring. You know, it's impossible to watch. I can't tell which guy is you. And there have been times when, you know, over the years, different situations when she's been sitting on a cliff having tea at a hotel. I'm out surfing. I'm the only person in the water. I'm right there. The waves are good. After every wave, I'll pull out and, honey, did you take one? You know, I mean, just like the zero. It's really boring to watch. It's closer to, I don't know what, hunting. I mean, you're waiting. It's different on different days, obviously. Sometimes there's more, you know, fast and furious action. It is generally thought to be frustrating, and depends on how you experience it. And there's also what looks like simple waiting is not at all that, really, unless you're talking about people who aren't really surfing; they're just kind of out there. But mostly, surfers are engaged in this. This you may or may not know from what you see, but really, really engaged. Almost all surfers in this very close study of, like, at their local spot of this little patch of coast, and I mean everything, in every down to every rock and every shifting sandbar, in every condition, every angle of swell, every size of swell, every period of swell, of course, every wind condition, and on, all the tide, all these factors, trying to understand what the waves are doing or what they're going to do next. And that's it. That's potentially that's the intellectual work of surfing. That's what everybody's doing out there, if they're actually surfing, which they probably are. They're trying to figure out what the ocean is going to do next, and it's quite a. I mean, some spots you can really get it wired. At more complex, you know, some of the great waves in the world. It's a lifetime's work trying to understand the place and what the ocean's doing there at any given moment, and what it's going to do in the next moment, especially, so you can put yourself in the right place, and what you should do. And it's a lifetime's work to understand that place. And I'm engaged in any number of those, even on the East Coast. And conditions change. So that's what's going on out there, really.
I just want to add, Bill explains this really eloquently and very well in the book about that. And so you really understand what that study is, and some people might be out there mindless, but the serious surfers are there. It is. It's oceanography. It's oceanography.
Yeah, it's like applied oceanography, really.
Yeah.
And I think some of the reason hardcore surfers have kind of responded to this book too is because I'm articulating a lot of what we're thinking out there, like theories that you come up with about what might happen next and how you think it. The angles you look at someone's reaction down the line as they're paddling over a wave that you can't see over, and you know who that person is, how they're liable to react. Ooh, he did this as he went out of sight. That tells me something else, and you go this way. And these kind of super subtle bits of current and so on. And serious surfers read that and think, oh, yeah. Nobody ever would write this down. Who cares?
Right.
But yeah, so there's
Yeah.
yes.
You-
Sorry.
Yeah. No. Sorry. Paskowitz. Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Big family. Mm. Mm-hmm. 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 Uh-huh. That sounds realistic. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Doc
Thanks.
Paskowitz passed away. Was it last year or 2 years ago?
Recently, yeah.
He just passed away. But yeah, it's a comic tragedy family in many respects. But an interesting documentary. Yeah. Couple.
Ah, well, I live in New York City, and I sometimes travel for waves, and sometimes grab waves in my travels. I travel a lot as a reporter. I've lately been doing book publicity, so I was just in France, and ooh, it's gonna be good, and I hastily rearranged the schedule and borrow boards and wetsuits and surf, so there's that. But mainly, I surf around New York City. Um, where there's quite good waves. I almost don't want to say that. On the South Shore of Long Island and on the Jersey Shore. I mainly surf the north end of the Jersey Shore because it's closer. Because you try to work this into your daily routine, and the waves tend to be better in the winter when the days are short, and of course it's horribly cold. In fact, it was really good yesterday in New Jersey. My little group that I surf with's been texting me, "You're missing it. You're missing it. Where are you?" So there's around there, the South Shore of Long Island out to Montauk at the end, but there are places in closer. And Jersey had a fantastic fall and pretty good this winter too.
Sir.
Uh huh. Was that blonde groupies? Uh huh. Not true at all in my experience. No. Said it? Not, no, it's really not. In fact, a few people reading this book said, "Why did you write about women surfing?" And 'cause a lot of women do surf, especially now. I mean, more and more. And there's a women's pro tour. Some women surf really good, like much better than 99% of men. But I don't write about them all in this book because I haven't really had a lot of the books about friendship, about the people I shared a spot with or travels with or a part of my life with, and complicated friendships and male friendships, and they just I've never had a surf partner who was a woman, but it's really in my experience of it been quite a boys' world. I mean, to this day, I take surf trips like down Baja, and it's always a group of guys in my experience. Um, and so no, I don't know where these glorious women were, but they weren't in my circuit.
They're in the Australian biographies.
Yeah.
There was.
Yeah, yeah. It is pretty disparate. I don't know. I mean, for the longest time, and still, really until I started writing about surfing, I would say, which in recent times, um, surfing was just this thing I did. I grew up doing it. It becomes like a deeply ingrained habit. It's just something you kind of feel you need to do, and you're always looking for waves. And at some point, as you're growing up, you have to make some decisions where you're going to live and whether it's like surfing going to be the main thing. And I know surfing's not going to be the main thing. I would say I was always interested in writing and literature and kind of exploring the world apart from surfing, but it was just stayed there, kind of unspoken, unexamined. And at some point, I described how I ended up with an assignment to write about surfing, and for the first time wrote something. And I was writing about a guy who's a bit of an evangelist of surfing, this doctor I mentioned. He just was convinced that surfing was good for you, which I did not believe at all. And so we had this sort of ongoing argument. To me, surfing was this niggling addiction. To him, it was like the center of his life, and it should be. And then it's kind of changed for me since then, but it's different for different people. I would say the physical thrill of surfing good waves is pretty deep, and then it pervades everything as you try to find more good waves, which is not so easy. So I think we're running.
I think we're. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for
you
coming
very,
out.
very much.
Thanks.